our focus on the climate crisis in the time of COVID-19. Bienvenidos a todos. Me llamo Roberto Múcaro Borrero. Soy del pueblo Taino y voy a servir como moderador de la programa de hoy. If you can allow me just one moment of patience before we begin with our introduction and our panelists, we will have just a moment to take some instructions on how to use the Zoom interpretation feature. We have simultaneous translation in English and Spanish today, so there are just a few notes that we will share. Vamos a compartir por un minuto algunas instrucciones para la función de interpretación, porque tenemos traducción en inglés y en español hoy. So voy a empezar primero con el inglés. I'm going to start first with the English translation so that you can all see, and just give me a moment here so I can share my screen with you. Okay, you should all be able to see my screen right now. These are the instructions in English for the Zoom attendees. So if you want to hear English, you will first locate the interpretation icon. It's at the bottom right of your screen, and you'll see a little globe and the word interpretation. You'll want to click on that and then select English. After you select English, the second thing you need to do is select mute original audio. Here's the image of what you should be seeing on your screen. It says select the language here, so you'll click English and then mute original audio. This is very important because if you don't mute the original audio, you'll hear both the translation and the English at the same time. And this will be the same for Spanish, and I want to just now go over to the Spanish for our Spanish speakers. Y para los que hablan español, aquí son las instrucciones para la función de interpretación de la plataforma de Zoom. Primero, localiza el icono de interpretación. Está en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Aquí es una imagen a donde tú puedes ver un globito, y abajo de ese globito dice interpretación, interpretation. Después de eso, seleccione español. Y aquí es la imagen. Seleccione español y después, y esto es muy importante, seleccione mute original audio, que quiere decir apaga el audio original. Esto es muy importante porque si no hagan eso, vas a escuchar los dos idiomas en el mismo vez. Ok, so ahora voy a volver en inglés porque tenemos interpretación en español. Okay, so now that we have our instructions down, I'm going to begin with a very brief some introductory remarks, and we will then follow through with our speakers. After I give the introduction, our first speaker will be Hindu Ibrahim, and she'll be sharing right after me. So with that, I want to do another screen share, and then I'll begin my presentation here. Okay, today is Juneteenth. It's an annual holiday in the U.S. commemorating the official end of slavery in the United States. And I felt that it was important to note this event during our panel, as there's clear connections from slavery and the theft and exploitation of natural resources to the current issues of environmental justice and the disproportionate effects Black and Indigenous peoples face from COVID-19. Our struggles continue and they intersect. Now, today's program will be highlighting how our distinguished panelists are working in their homelands and internationally to address climate change, its causes and impacts. You'll hear how their efforts have been affected by COVID-19, as well as how some countries are using the pandemic to implement projects and policies that are directly contributing to the climate crisis. So as a reminder, the appearance of COVID-19 is not the beginning of our story as Indigenous peoples when it comes to the climate crisis. We were already experiencing disproportionate impacts due to the climate crisis, and that hasn't changed with the coming of COVID-19. Now, in previous webinars that have taken place during this IITC series, we've learned how some countries are taking advantage of the pandemic to push forward non-sustainable, extractive activities that directly contribute to climate change and further violate the rights of Indigenous peoples, undermine health and increase vulnerabilities to the pandemic. And this is while science is affirming that the appearance of COVID-19, similarly to the climate crisis, is a result of mankind's exploitative and violent relationship with our Mother Earth. Now, back in my homeland, my ancestral homeland in the Caribbean islands, for example, extreme weather events are clearly connected to the climate crisis. However, these climate events are also connected to the deeply rooted and pervasive impacts of racism, colonialism, corporate greed, capitalism, and the lack of political will that perpetuates policies that are short-sighted and out of balance when compared to traditional Indigenous-based knowledge, which is based on right relationship and reciprocity. Just going to switch my slide here again. Now, the ongoing cycle of neglect and inequality is further displayed, at least in the case of the Taino and in my homelands, with the substandard humanitarian and economic responses by governments who are obliged to assist us. All the while, the most marginalized, children, women, persons with disabilities, older persons are all disproportionately and negatively affected by the lack of access to quality healthcare, food insecurity, rising unemployment. Now, both climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbate these tensions in all these areas. And this is even resulting in some cases to increasing domestic violence. And oftentimes as Indigenous peoples, we say, you have to connect the dots. Environmental violence is connected to violence against women, is connected to racism, and so on. So in closing, this webinar will also focus on the effects and the efforts, rather, of Indigenous peoples to have our voices heard and ensure our right to participation in the international multilateral system. Since the 1970s, Indigenous peoples have made significant yet incremental progress at the United Nations level, for example, but that progress has affirmed most recently that our traditional knowledge is a solution to many of the issues we face. And so I'm leaving you here with this last slide that is taken from the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which highlights that Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm very honored to be able to introduce to you Hindu Ibrahim. She's from the Borrero community. She's an expert member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as of the Facilitative Working Group for the UN Framework on Climate Change, Local Communities, and Indigenous Peoples Platform. So Hindu, when you're ready, you have the floor, and welcome.
Thank you very much, dear brother Roberto. It's really always a great pleasure and great honor to be with you. Firstly, I would like to thank the ICT and especially the director, my sister Andrea Carmen, for organizing this webinar, who is really in a good timing now, because Roberto reminding us that it is time of the COVID, who is hitting all the world, but hitting more severely indigenous peoples. And it is time of the climate crisis that hitting us in the several places much deeper than others. And of course, this time of the racism that raising up around all the world, but especially in the US, among indigenous peoples and among Black peoples. So as coming from Africa and coming from indigenous communities from Chad, you understand why it is very important in talking to me all the three different items. So firstly, we are hitting by climate change very severely in order of changing our way of life. So we have the drought who become more and more high than before. And then we have like in Chad already experiencing plus 1.5 degree. And that means our water resources is shrinking. Our food is becoming an issue, and access to the land and resources creating a lot of conflict between the communities. And secondly, in the COVID, now it's increasing all what indigenous people experiencing, because the lockdown in our countries make us more vulnerable. So we used to be a transboundary peoples, where like my communities who are nomadic can move from one place to another one beyond the border. So now we cannot do that because they close the border, and the natural resources who is there is shrinking. And that's created a conflict. The police, because they don't have masks, they do not know how to use all the social distances, because all the information are giving only in French or Arabic and limited to the town. But we do not have a translation of all this, what is happening. And thirdly, in order of talking about the racism, so as African, we are in Africa, that's fine. But as being indigenous peoples, we are already discriminated by others, discriminated because of our race, discriminated because of our identity, and because of our life and livelihood. So through all the different issues, it's becoming so marginalized for us. But what we can do to face it. So for the climate change in Chad and in many countries in Africa, we are frontline with our own solutions. There are no government solutions that coming to us because we are not involved in many of the plan, but we push them because of recognition of our knowledge, who are very crucial to make our adaptation and mitigations. Now to think and talk with some governments. For example, in Burkina Faso, and now like in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to organize from the FAR a training to the Benin governments, how they can include indigenous people's knowledge through the national adaptation plan, and how they can consider also indigenous people's knowledge and rights through the national mitigation plans. So we are helping them if they do not respect what is decided in the Paris. I know that my brother Grams and then also my sister Pasang will talk about it. So they cannot get what they are asking for. And secondly, in the COVID, tomorrow my team in my organization will go to the communities to give them the basic information about what is COVID, what is going on around the world, and what will be the measures. And we can assist them with some masks and then explain to them what measure they can take. And then after that, maybe we can plan and come and lobby the government. But in terms of racism, I think like globally, it is the issue of human rights. And this is where it is very important that we all come together as indigenous peoples and fighting through the Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, and fighting also collectively in all the fora that we have. We really appreciate our global coordination, because that can have a lot of impact on indigenous people's movement in Africa, but around the world in general. So for now, I stop here, and I'm really very happy to be with you. And if there is anything I can add from the African side or from the indigenous peoples that I'm representing through the facilitative working group with Andrea, with Pasang, so we'll be also very happy to come back and talk about it. But just to end, what have decided around COVID, they put billions and billions in the tables. So we believe that these billions can be turn it up and invest on indigenous peoples. So I'm receiving like some people's asking me what we can do to help indigenous peoples. So I'm telling them always, you can give the indigenous peoples the direct access to the funding, and we can decide in our community how we can face COVID and how we can face climate change and how we can fight racism all together. Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you all the brothers and sisters. I'm there and listening to you.
Thank you so much, my sister Hindu. Always a pleasure to hear you, and thank you so much for, again, highlighting, at least in one part, about the connection of racism and the violation of human rights and how we have to mobilize around that issue. So with that in mind, I want to introduce our next speaker. I have the pleasure to introduce Frank Ettawageshik. He's from the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. He's an elder, a respected elder, and a technical advisor for the National Congress of American Indians Intertribal Task Force on Climate Change. Frank, it's always a pleasure to have you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's good to be part.
Mucho, un gusto estar aquí y formar una parte de este grupo el día de hoy.
Rebecca, we're hearing your Spanish.
Sorry. Okay. There we go. Change it. Sorry. Thank you.
All right. Great. I apologize about that, Frank. Please continue.
Okay. Well, I'll start over again. Ani, pipiguao dodem waganak sing and don chuba nakwegeshik conditionakaz. My name is Frank Ettawageshik, otherwise known as Noonday. And I live at the land of the crooked tree. And my clan is the Sparrowhawk. I live on the shores of Lake Michigan in a beautiful place, beautiful outside right now. Very abundant water around us, but nevertheless it's threatened. And we think about that from the changing climate. There is no doubt that the world is suffering from a pandemic. Health issues and healthcare disruptions are causing people to respond in unprecedented ways. Travel restrictions, political uncertainties, economic distress, and social injustices are compounding to test what our technological society had come to rely on as normal. Given all of this, it would be easy to think of the pandemic as the most important issue of our time. While it is of great importance, it pales in significance to the climate emergency that we are facing. In the long span of human history, a pandemic will be a note in the history books. The climate emergency, however, has the potential of bringing to an end the world civilization as we have known it, perhaps making the earth uninhabitable for human beings. This reality is no longer a concern for common generations.
I'm sorry, the interpreter cannot hear you. There's interference in your connection. Can you maybe close windows that you have open for, my apologies.
Yes, if you have any additional windows, Frank, you're on mute right now, but if you have any additional windows open, it might be good to close everything else, as there was some distortion. We weren't able to hear the beginning. Yes, I think
I only have one window open.
Okay.
Nothing else is running on the computer.
It sounds better now.
And I'm about 12 inches from my router, so
okay, great. So
I'm about as good a signal as I'm going to get. I'm sorry. And my screen says my audio is muted, but can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. And what I had said is that the climate emergency is no longer a concern for the coming generations. And the current generation are already losing their lives to climate emergency. But it needs a person to make in their lives, make demands on our activities,
We're having
and
this
to give them.
yeah. I think everybody else's mic muted. I think I see everybody else's mic is muted. I'm sorry, Frank. It just, you start out really good and then it just goes into distortion. So I don't know what's
Okay.
what the issue is. Graham is suggesting that maybe I see everybody else is muted, so it shouldn't be interference there. And let's see. Somebody is suggesting maybe shut off your video for a moment and just try the audio and see if we can get your message in that way. Again,
Okay, I'll try that.
Okay,
Now we'll try again.
Okay, I really apologize, but I'm not really sure what's going on.
Okay. We'll try again and see how this works. Let me know. We can make progress, but it needs each person to make adaptation in their daily lives, to make demands on our elected leaders to take bold steps, and to give the leaders support when they do take those steps. The nations members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have made paper pledges to identify the issues and to take necessary steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They need to be held accountable to these pledges. The nations are expected to develop and revise nationally determined contributions, which when aggregated will reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a level to attempt to hold global temperature rise to the Paris Accord goal of well under 2 degrees Celsius with 1.5 degrees in mind. As Indigenous peoples, we joined the successful efforts to set this temperature rise goal. And we also joined the successful efforts to make sure that human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples, were included in the Paris negotiations. With the inclusion of the local communities and Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge platform in the Paris Accord, this ancient living knowledge reservoir of how to respect and live with the natural world is beginning to be incorporated in the international response to the climate emergency. Our efforts need to be two-pronged, however. We must first engage with the UNFCCC member nations to hold them to their NDC process, the Nationally Determined Contribution process, and to inform them of ways to better achieve their goals. Secondly, and more importantly, we must act to meet our sacred duties in the natural world, to live by our traditional teachings. We must show the respect for this world through our actions and the way of life we practice. Our prayers, ceremonies, songs, and dances maintain their importance to how Indigenous peoples contribute to this global effort. As Indigenous peoples, we can encourage our families, communities, and nations to take actions that will put our traditional knowledge in play in a context that will interact with the work of the UNFCCC member nations. One proposal is to have Indigenous peoples each develop an indigenously determined contribution based on our interaction with the fossil fuel infrastructure. These IDCs would vary widely depending on how integrated our communities are with the surrounding non-Indigenous systems. My tribal government, for example, runs a gaming enterprise that uses a lot of electricity and natural gas. Over the last decade, mostly by changing light bulbs to LEDs and installing more efficient motors in our HVAC equipment, we have eliminated the need for nearly 500,000 metric tons of carbon fuels. Decreasing food wastes and repurposing used cooking oils as biodiesel fuels have also contributed. While my tribe's territory is surrounded by the United States and uses considerable energy, even those indigenous peoples, nations, and communities in less developed parts of the world have opportunities to make contributions via an indigenously determined contribution. All of these changes, either NDCs or IDCs, ultimately rely on personal actions. This brings me to a last point, an individually determined contribution, IDP. How we incorporate our traditional teachings into our daily lives can guide us to small changes in our routines that can add up to much larger impacts. Walking more, driving less, taking the stairs instead of an elevator, using natural light and readapting our lives to the seasons, participating in tribal, local, and regional decision-making to help keep or remake our communities more pedestrian welcoming. And most importantly, to live a way of life that respects our place in the natural world and all of the beings who share their places with us. As indigenous people, we cannot wait for the nation states of the world to willingly do their part to deal with the climate emergency. We must demonstrate our ability to live our talk, practice what we expect others to do, and to engage those nation states at every opportunity to stress that their lives and ours as well will depend on the course of actions that they take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that. And I really love the indigenous, nationally determined contributions aspect that you brought up. I think that's brilliant, and is really a way that indigenous peoples who are engaging the international system can really come back with something creative. And it's wonderful to hear that example that you shared for us. Our next speaker is Pasang, Dolma Sherpa. She's calling in from Nepal, and she's the co-chair of the Facilitative Working Group for the UN Framework on Climate Change, Local Communities, and Indigenous Peoples platform. Pasang, unmute your mic and you have the floor.
Thank you. Unmute myself. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you very much, all brothers and sisters. This is my great pleasure to be part of the team, and I really thank International's Indian Treaty Councils and my friend Andrea for giving this great opportunity to share and join with all the panelists and also with all the participants, and really looking forward to have any thoughts of exchanging thoughts later on, maybe after the presentation. Chris is helping me to make the my presentation, or should I share my screen? Okay, Chris, yeah. Okay, so so basically, I will be just highlighting my presentation on how in the climate crisis, how indigenous peoples are facing in the time of COVID-19. Please next. Yeah. So, the present, I will be covering, how we are impacts of the climate change, and how COVID has impacts on indigenous people, and what are our concerns. Yeah, next, please. You can move on. Yeah, I just yeah. I'll just give a little bit backgrounds, like we all are aware that climate change is a reality. It's not no more it's a natural, but it's more becoming more unnatural, because we all are facing the challenges, and especially hit to the indigenous peoples and for our continuation of our livelihoods. And the prediction from the IPCC also, the negative impacts, the possible negative impacts for sustaining our livelihoods, our ecosystem, biodiversity, if we do not do anything to, as our brother just mentioned, Frank, that if we do not change our livelihoods or lifestyles. Yeah. Can you please move a little bit ahead? Can you please go ahead a little bit further down? Yeah, great, thank you. So, you know, like in the impacts of the climate change is everywhere, no doubt. But no, on the earlier slide, please. No, not this one. Earlier, the fourth slide. The fourth slide. No, earlier, please, earlier. With the mountains, with the Nepal's picture, can you go ahead? Yeah, yeah, thank you. So so you know, we all are aware that the impacts of climate change. Sorry, can you please go ahead? No, ahead. You are moving very fast.
It was the one that
With
said rise in temperatures. Rise in
yeah,
temperatures.
yeah, with the map. With the map, just only no.
You'll have to go
This is
back
what
up.
happened. Yeah, you have to go the backup. This is what happens. Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Please hold on, hold on. So you know, like the temperature rises everywhere, but its impacts in the higher mountains, especially the mountains, mountain region of Nepal. You can see in the mountains, all the red spot is the spot where the glaciers is in the state of bursting. No, the glacier lakes are coming up. So in the mountains, majority, almost 95% are indigenous people. Almost 18 groups of indigenous peoples in the mountains are really suffering and already hit by the impacts of the climate change. And you know, the temperature rises of the temperature of Nepal is much higher than the rises of the average rises of the temperature of the world. But rises of the temperature in the mountain is much higher than the lower belt of Nepal. So you can also see already how, you know, it has impacts on the, you know, livelihoods. They're you know, they're sustaining their traditional practices that I will be covering, showing in another slides. Can you please move ahead now? Yeah, yeah, you can move ahead. Yeah, okay, so can you go a little bit up slowly? Yeah, okay, thank you. So you can see in this picture, no, you can see in this picture, please don't move. Yeah, please see. Well, so this picture shows already a lot of things that how the impacts of climate change is you know, on the day-to-day lives of the indigenous people. You can see on the left side, these are the indigenous people's house in the Mustang, the upper in the mountains. So generally we do not have a roof, just a mud roof, and with the pure firewood, because we have a snow only. But nowadays what is happening, it's raining, so it's no more no, the mud roof is no more you know, holding the water, and the snow coverage is really decreasing. So that has consequence of changing their you know, the house, like putting the roof, the tin roof, or migrating from the area. So the second picture is very important for religious perspective as well. This is a sacred site. It's a moving prayer wheel, which is being moved through the water from the mountains. But in some part, the bursting state of the lakes. But another part is you know, there's no water. The water is drying. So you know, and then the communities, you know, the challenges faced by the communities for continuation of the traditional livelihoods. Yeah, yeah, please go ahead. Move ahead. Can you please move the slide? Yeah, a little bit down. So a little bit further down. Yeah, okay, thank you. So, you know, these are the different challenges of the climate change impacts, you know, our cultural impacts, our livelihoods, our traditional knowledge, and, you know, and but we all are aware. We all, I'm sure, like, you know, you know already the global study and also the realization of our day-to-day lives and our work on the ground, you know. So there are huge contributions. There are, you know, like a important, crucial role played by indigenous traditional knowledge and our cultural practices for sustaining the remaining resources, ecosystem, biodiversity, and also the climate change adaptation and mitigation. So, we all are aware. And can you please move ahead down? Next, please. Yeah. So and then also we all are aware that how the small population of indigenous people around the world are already contributing for the world's largest more than 80% biodiversity, and also contributing for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So this is the reality that indigenous peoples being a forefront to the impacts of climate change and the challenges facing in terms of our protecting our knowledge and our practices and skills and livelihoods, but yet contributors for climate change resilience. As our other brother Frank also said, like why we need to change our livelihoods, but indigenous people's livelihoods is already been there. So this is how we have been going on continuing. So only fact is like how we how the global trend, how the westernized how the colonizations trend of more from the capitalistic worldview that has been undermining our indigenous worldview, and that's how the crisis we are facing all. Next please. Yeah, yeah, further down. Yeah. So, in the context, just sharing some thoughts from Nepal as well. In Nepal, 59 indigenous groups are already identified. Now one is added, so 60 indigenous peoples recently. So, it's 35% of the total population are indigenous peoples. And, we all the indigenous peoples in Nepal, they have their own customary institutions, very alive, very big role in management of the resources. For example, like my culture, Sherpas in the mountains, we have a Nawa traditional customary institution with our self-governance, with our self rules and regulation. So Gapo for Dolpo, and so there are so many, all the indigenous people, they have their own customary institution, and that contributed for our cultural diversity, contributed for the conservation and the management of resources, and ultimately climate change resilience. But the problem we have is these institutions are never been acknowledged by the legal provisions and legal policy and programs in our country. And this is a must. The situation is the same in other part of the countries in Asia and also in Africa, and I'm sure in Latin America and North America as well, because our role and contributions remains as kind of remains as, and then also not accepted as the solution to the crisis we are facing. So this is the big gap in understanding. So this is why we need to have our strong voice in the global levels to make each country realize that indigenous peoples who are impacts of the climate change are also also contributing for climate change resilience. If we continue that our practices, and then in a long run will make the healthy environment for our future generation. So you can all this song and dance and all are mimicking the nature, protecting the nature and being part of the nature. So can you please move next? Yeah, next please. Yeah, next please. Yeah, so yeah, so the situation, like as our sister Hindu also mentioned earlier, that the indigenous people are forefront to the impacts of climate change, and now they are forefront to the impacts of the COVID-19 because of so many other reasons. But yet we are also part of the solution. So in Nepal, indigenous peoples community, they have decided to have a self-isolations, and many indigenous communities that are already in their self-quarantine, and that has given an opportunity that the reviving and trusting more on the traditional healing practices. Like Amji is traditional healers who've been there because everything has been shut down, and there's no access to the health posts, and no transportation. So all the treatments are now back to their Amji, back to their traditional healers. So this is also opportunity for our young generation to learn that you have all the solution, we have all the you can rely on, and you can further move on, and then And also this is the another one opportunity. But another challenge is like the indigenous peoples who are not acknowledging the importance of their traditional livelihoods, not allowing to enter to the national parks for their livelihoods like fishing, collecting the natural resources, whereas on the other hand the poaching and illegal logging is increasing. So this is the another scenario of the impacts of the climate change and also impacts of this pandemic at the moment. And then in this pandemic, especially the poor indigenous people, especially who are living day-to-day wages for employment, small business holders, with a person with the disabilities are severely hit because of the it has a really negative impacts on their regular income to support their family. So this COVID, despite they have been, efforting themselves to protect their communities, but still, had impacts to the continuity of their livelihoods. Next, please. I hope I'm not moving that fast for the translator. Can you please? Yeah. So this is the another picture that I just got. I'm just from the yesterday's picture. It's in our community. Like this is the Gurung community where I have been working almost for many years. So all the communities, all the elders, they are gathered together and then worshiping the nature, and then they collecting their efforts to protect their community from the COVID and from any kind of illness and any kind of harmful or any kind of climate change disasters. So every time they have been being together, worshiping, connecting to their ancestors. So, and this has been still continued. So this has given an opportunity for young generation to learn from the elders, because all the children now, they do not have a school and they are back to their communities, and the challenges are there, but also opportunity for indigenous, especially the youth, learning from their ancestors and elders. And next, please. I'm almost at the end. So what is happening? So we all are aware that the indigenous peoples are forefront to the impacts of climate change, now the pandemic. So one of the main core challenges for indigenous people is lack of their land rights. So tenure rights. So tenure rights is one of the crucial fundamental to overcome the impacts of climate change, also the impacts of this COVID or any kind of natural disasters or any kind of future pandemic, because they are the guardian of the world's forests and biodiversity, and this is not been acknowledged, and this is possible only through the acknowledgement of their land tenures and land titles and security. So in this pandemic, COVID pandemic, if the indigenous people are allowed to enter their forests and continue their traditional livelihoods, they would not be suffer to support their family. But their role and contribution and their livelihoods are least concerns from the eyes of the policymakers or from the eyes of the decision makers. So this is what we need to address in the globally and also nationally, to have a implication on the grounds to protect our people, protect our communities, and respect their human rights. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. So I do not want to give more time on this one, because our others friends will also be covering. But the respecting our human rights, respecting our livelihoods, respecting our traditional knowledge, our practices. So finally we have the platform for local communities and indigenous peoples, and my friends Andrea and our sister Hindu, and also many other our indigenous brothers and sisters around the world from the 7 regions are there to speak on behalf of indigenous people, to respect our human rights, respect our knowledge, respect our traditional practices. That has contributed for climate change resilience, and at least acknowledge and promote that one through the 3 functions: knowledge, capacity building, and climate change policy and action. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. And this is my okay, go on a little bit. Yeah, this is my last slide. So during this pandemic, how we are, making our efforts to address the climate change and respect the human rights of indigenous people, and promote and give the opportunity of transferring the knowledge system to the future generation, and also making aware the policymakers, the state parties, to acknowledge the values and role of the indigenous stories and experience and our cultural values that has contributed for climate change resilience. So we had a virtual meetings of FWG recently to update all the 12 activities that is directly linked to the 3 function of the platform, and 3 function of the platform that has acknowledge of our cultural values and respecting our human rights and respecting our knowledge system. And then we also had a virtual stakeholders dialogue recently, a part of the UNFCCC momentum of climate change on 9th June, and also getting suggestion from the stakeholders. And we, if things gets back to normal, we anticipate to have face-to-face FWG3 meetings in Bonn in October, followed by our capacity trainings in October as well. This capacity training is very, very important for LCIP, for all our indigenous peoples, brothers and sisters, because this, we hope, this capacity trainings more target to the state parties, so that they will be aware about the values, the concept, the role and the contribution of indigenous peoples in climate change resilience, and continue protecting our resources and biodiversity. The next, please. Yeah. Next one. Yeah. Go ahead. Just a picture of our, of our friends in the FWG, that how we are working so hard, all the addressing all the challenges. And Andrea has been really, really provocative for, how we move ahead our human rights, and our from North America, and Hindus from Africa, and all the friends actually around the world working really, really hard for implementation of 12 activities to fulfill the 3 functions, so that we'll have a equal respect and in our hometown, home country as well. Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, next one. So this is just another article. You can also see in the website that I contributed 1 articles about my own story of a journey of the climate change since 2009 in the UNFCCC. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, can you go the next one, please?
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. I must have taken more time than expected, but and I hope I did not speak much. I was okay with the translator. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pasang. We appreciate your detailed presentation, and the information that you shared about the facilitative working group. I'm sure we'll be hearing a little bit more about that in the other presentations coming up. I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Robinson Lopez from the Inga Nation from Colombia. He's the Director for Climate Change and Biodiversity of COICA, which is the Indigenous coordinating body for the Amazon Basin. Robinson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. To begin with, a very cordial greeting to all of the participants and organizations, and especially to the International Indian Treaty Council. On behalf of COICA, the coordinating body of indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you, to all of the panelists, and to everyone for joining here with us. I would like to tell you a little bit about COICA's work. COICA is an international organization at the highest level, which represents over 506 indigenous peoples in Latin America, in over 9 countries where we are located. Coyavi is our representative in Brazil, in Peru, we have representation in Ecuador and in Colombia as well, and Venezuela. In Guyana, the organization APA represents us. there's an organization representing us in Suriname as well. And Koika also represents 66 peoples in voluntary isolation, over 500 million square kilometers of territory. So we represent some 28% of the population in the Amazon basin, and much of the world's carbon is stored in this region, and that's why it is considered the most important biome with regards to climate change. We also hold 20% of the world's freshwater resources and important biodiversity systems that are threatened not only by the pandemic, but by other threats such as climate change and other very serious threats that we believe must be stressed. It's important to point out that there are 8 countries in the Amazon basin. In the case of Colombia, it's 7.93%, in Bolivia 5.93%, in Ecuador 1.35%, in Peru 11.17% of their, and in Brazil it's 59% of the areas that are within the Amazon basin. So the majority of the territory of that country is in the Amazon basin. Suriname 2% and 1.33% in other countries. The majority of these Amazon basin countries have territories in the Amazon basin. Indigenous peoples, most affected by COVID-19, are facing all of these effects related to culture, territory, political activity, exercise of authority. However, governments consider them invisible at the time when decisions are made, and indigenous peoples do not have the necessary protocols to deal with these issues and confront the pandemic. The humanitarian aid that has arrived is inadequate. And our peoples need a more holistic approach to this challenge. It's important to point out that in the Amazon region, none of the governments so far have a information and monitoring system that allows us to have daily statistics with regard to who in our communities are being affected. That is why COICA, as an international organization representing the countries in the Amazon region, coordinating together with REPAN, has began working on technical data to collect relevant information in our territories and to organize this and produce a report with detailed information about what is happening. And so on, we have information that an indigenous community of 8,700 people had on June 16th, many people affected, with 727 people affected. It's a relatively high number. And these numbers continue to rise. Unfortunately, we do not have full information from many of the other indigenous peoples where they govern their territories, and this silent enemy is attacking many of our peoples and ending lives. And we also confront other types of problems that are attacking indigenous peoples in our territories. And the pandemic increases the impacts of climate change, where we already had a precarious health situation in our lands with inadequate health infrastructure, corruption, criminalization, deforestation, to mention just a few of the problems that affect us, as well as wide-scale cattle ranching, colonization, racism that affects our peoples. And all of these factors, which create an imminent risk to indigenous peoples, including indiscriminate hunting in our territories, petroleum extraction activities. And for example, in Colombia, the systematic criminalization of our leaders who fight to defend our lives and our territories continues. 27 leaders have been assassinated in Colombia in the first quarter of 2020. It's a very difficult, problematic situation. And so who will protect our lands if our leaders are assassinated? We must recognize the important contributions of indigenous peoples made, for example, to the Paris Accords. However, these threats and assassinations and murders continue unabated and threatening our population. With regards to policy, governments in the region have a strategy to dismantle environmental protection in our territories and to open territories to more colonization, to more extractive industries. Dams are being built. We are experiencing these effects of racism and narco trafficking. Also, monocultures such as the African palm plantations that are invading our territories. The issues of racism in our nations continue in spite of the international agreements that are very important that have been signed regarding this issue, such as the ILO, such as the OAS declaration. Our peoples, in spite of these agreements, continue to face racism, and in facing the pandemic, governments have turned their back on the indigenous peoples. These are the persistent problems we face in our region that are intensifying more and more. With regard to extractive industries and attacks on indigenous peoples' communities during these quarantines, we have seen pipelines rupture and spilling over 800,000 barrels of crude into our lands. This happened in Peru. There is a report from civil society in Peru explaining this. We are seeing these agro industry and extractive industry activities continuing in Ecuador. Our grassroots organizations have reported that 120 communities are affected during the COVID-19 pandemic by river contamination, which is affecting their traditional fishing practices. In Colombia, for example, we have a very recent example from the Interior Ministry related to the consultation mechanisms using virtual channels. This should be part of real and effective consultation processes for indigenous peoples, for the original peoples. They have proposed virtual consultation mechanisms, which to us is a very serious problem that limits our ability to protest and file legal claims and affects our indigenous people's rights to free, prior, and informed consent and self-determination. And this affects our right to consultation. COICA, then, facing this situation, has launched a systematic approach to confront human rights violations in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. One of these initiatives is related to health and environmental and public health infrastructure in the Amazon Basin. And a campaign has been launched for indigenous peoples of the Amazon region to coordinate all bodies in the region, to coordinate with artists, with NGO partners, to initiate a campaign on behalf of indigenous peoples for humanitarian aid and respect for human rights. We have stressed the need for our indigenous guards to continue their work protecting our lands, for the exercise of control in our territories. Also, COICA has issued a call to denounce the violations of human rights of indigenous peoples that are occurring and to make this known throughout the world, in that it violates international protocols. Our campaign, as I said in the beginning, it's intended as a call to partners around the world, not only indigenous peoples, but also the worldwide community. Our ancestral communities are being lost. We are losing our traditions, and we are losing knowledge and wisdom needed to mitigate the effects of climate change.
Thank you. Has the speaker concluded?
May I?
No, not yet. Thank you very much, Robinson. I wasn't sure if that was a stop for you, but we appreciate the presentation, and I was very moved by the highlighting of the lack of humanitarian aid, which is reminiscent of what's happening with my own people on the island of Boriking, or Puerto Rico specifically. And also the highlight of the human rights defenders and the critical situation of human rights defenders in the region. Thank you very much for that. We have two speakers still in the queue for our panel. And our next speaker is Anders Oskal. He's Sami. He's calling in from Norway. He's the Secretary General for the Association of World Reindeer Herders. Anders, thank you very much for being here. You have the floor.
Good evening, everyone.
Buenas tardes a
And,
todos.
as we introduce ourselves in our way.
Rebecca, we hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and we also heard the interpreter. So,
Yes, okay.
okay, good. Thank you.
So I introduce myself in the Sami way when we present ourselves by the families and clans we originate from. I am a Sami. I live in a small Sami village called Odawa, which is in the highest part of Norway, the Arctic part of Norway. This is a small Sami village with 2,000 people, and is one of 2 municipalities in Norway where Sami is the majority language. I myself come from a family of reindeer herders, and we have been herding our reindeer, following our reindeer for as long as anyone can remember. The earliest relative of mine that we know of was born in 1490, 2 years before Columbus, here in Guadalajara. He was a reindeer herder. In the nearby areas, we have stone carvings that go back as much as 9,000 years. And so this is very much our ancestral lands. And I have reindeer myself, albeit I am not able to attend them as much as I should. Perhaps we could put on the slides now. Thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation to attend. And I'm very happy to be with you. And I'm also very, it makes me think when I am listening to the other panelists about the situation of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And I know also Andrea couldn't join us today for a very special situation, so our thoughts are with you. That said, I would like to just mention something. If we go back today 101 years to 1919, that was the time when the Spanish flu really was, let's say, ravaging our lands. In this village, this small area, the mortality for Sami people were 4 times higher than that of the rest of the Scandinavian countries. But I would like to say that my great grandparents from the Turi family, well, they got sick from the Spanish flu, but they did survive. And according to themselves, the reason why was that they used an old knowledge. You see, Sami people, we have a very specific food culture, and one of the things we don't do is to consume raw meat or blood. But in this case, they both got ill, very ill, but they consumed completely fresh reindeer blood. So every day they would kill a reindeer and consume the blood as much as they could. And according to themselves, this was what saved them both. Of course, I cannot say for sure that this was a miracle cure against the Spanish flu, but they did survive while others perished. If we could have the next slide, please. We have an organization, a civil society organization for nomadic reindeer herders in the world, called the Association of World Reindeer Herders. Next slide, please. And in this organization, we have 24 different indigenous peoples from all across the Arctic. You will note that this map is projected in a slightly different way. The North Pole is in the middle of the map. It shows the reindeer herding areas across 24 different indigenous peoples across 10 national states and 3 continents. Next slide, please. And reindeer herding is, some term it an industry, some term it a livelihood. More correctly, it is a way of life, or rather, as we say, an original civilization of the Arctic, an original civilization of the North. Because if you look into these pictures in the background, there's nothing here that could sustain human life. There's nothing for humans to live by. This is our ice cold desert, you could say. But the reindeer can survive here. And therefore, the reindeer herds and reindeer herders' knowledge about these animals is what keeps this civilization going to this day. Reindeer herders are still following our reindeer in a nomadic cycle every year, as our ancestors have done since time immemorial. Next slide, please. But this is a time of change, historical change, unprecedented change in the histories, very long histories of our peoples in the North. And I would like to say that while we are talking about the 1.5 or 2 degree target and fantasizing about the 1.5 degree target, some of our communities, for instance, in eastern Siberia on the Arctic coastline, have already seen a seasonal temperature increase of 6.2 degrees up to 7 degrees of warming already. So we can forget about the 2 degree target. We passed that long time ago. And this means increase and changes in snow conditions that are very difficult for the reindeer. We've just come out of a snow crisis here in the Scandinavian region this winter. In eastern Siberia, we've seen snow depths aggregated of 2 to 3 meters, even beyond that. And we're seeing forest fires. Eastern Siberia is on fire as we speak. And of course, it's fully deserved that the tribes in the Amazon have got a lot of focus. That's very important. But I can assure you that the consequences are no less dire for the reindeer herding nomadic peoples in Siberia. And this impacts our whole foundation for life, the biodiversity, our food systems, food webs, and the nomadic way of life itself. And it is the combination of factors that is a legitimate concern to the future of some of our reindeer herding peoples. And there is a link between climate change and changed use of the Arctic, land encroachment, fragmentation of grazing lands and migration routes. And as I was also co-author of the IPCC AR5 Work Group 2 report on adaptation, the polar regions chapter, that chapter concludes that the most important adaptive strategy for reindeer herders under climate change is protection of the grazing land. Sadly, that is not the picture that we see, perhaps especially on an aggregated level in Scandinavia. It is particularly concerning. In this region, we've lost 30% of the pasture land in 50 years, and additional 25% is so heavily impacted that it's barely usable for reindeer pastures anymore. And this is connected to mitigation efforts, connected to windmill parks, hydropower, and even the so-called green mining, which they try to convince us is crucial for a green shift. Green mining, I've never heard of a worse term. And then on top of all of this, on top of all the other challenges that our peoples are facing, we have climate change, we have land use change, and now we have also COVID. And the virus is bad enough, but the politics of the virus is no better. It brings out, I think, the worst and the best in people. There was mentioning of racism. And I think we also have to acknowledge that our own peoples may not be an exemption to that rule. but it also brings out the worst and best in political systems. And if we look at the narratives that we've been hearing from industry, policymakers, and interest groups, it's often our areas in the north is seen as a wilderness, a frontier, where we have a sort of room for all narrative, which is, of course, at best misguided in many ways, but there seems to be a equality assumption laying at the core, assuming that 1 square meter of land is just 1 square meter of land, refusing to see or being unable to see and understand the complexities of reindeer herders' land use. And it is the weakest part of the chain that breaks it all. And nomadism is what is at stake, not only pastures. And I'd like to perhaps bring about some examples then from Scandinavia, or talk a little bit about the experience we have now in Scandinavia, where suddenly in the midst of the COVID economic meltdown, there was a focus on job creation, where leading national politicians brought forward the view that we cannot afford anymore to put environment before jobs. Now, this view was not adopted by the authorities, but it does illustrate the dangers of the situation that we are in just now. Because how can we afford not to have a long-term focus? How can we afford not to take care of Mother Nature and be sustainable? So we need to somehow shift the focus here from a political timescale over to a multi-generational timescale. And how to do that? Well, that may be we need to elaborate that some more. But I'm also rounding up, I'd like to, if I may, comment a little bit on what Pasang was saying concerning the capitalist worldview versus our worldview. Because ours is, for sure, we could call it a pre-capitalist society, where capitalism, in order for capitalism to work, one had to invent fictitious commodities, says Pugliani in the book, The Great Transformation. Capitalism had to invent money, which we didn't have before. It had to invent labor. And most importantly, it had to invent ownership to land. And this reflects much of the challenges that I think we are seeing today. Also, Pasang mentioned about self-governance systems that are not acknowledged. And that has been the case. But you could say, for instance, Sami people, we have our SIDA system, self-governance system. But what's happening here is that the authorities are saying that they are acknowledging it and bringing it into the governance systems. But in so doing, they are redefining the content of the terms. So their definition of SIDA is something different from ours. And we can see that their definition is colored according to some other purpose that needs to be served. So that's, we had a session with some students from the US this morning, and they asked the question, did the states use traditional knowledge in designing the governance of reindeer herding? And that was today's discussion around the coffee table, because that was not the situation. Our knowledge was not used. So we need to, I think, even to mention this will have proponents of traditional democracy shaking their heads, but we need to somehow move from bipartisan systems or majority democratic systems to systems reflecting consensus. Considering what is efficient, and what is effective. Because we need something else for this to work out on a grand scale. We can observe instead that the opposite seems to be happening, because in the case of reindeer herding in Scandinavia, for instance, the trend has been the opposite way, to introduce the wonderful 51% legal and moral right to do the others over. And those are at least some perspectives from my side. How do we proceed from here? We need to, of course, focus on our own capacity to handle our own destinies, our own future. Building institutions, building organizations, and perhaps most importantly, building the competence and confidence of our youth to become the leaders that we need to handle this future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders, for that, and for sharing these very important slides. I really enjoyed seeing the map from that perspective, not often seen when we see maps, so that was great. Very quickly, we don't have much time, and I do want to give our last speaker the opportunity to share a little bit. Our last speaker is Graham Reed, Anishinaabe from Canada. He's the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. Graham, you have the floor. Just keep in mind your hard stop and our ending shortly.
Yeah, Anin, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Graham Reed, Indigenous Cause, Odawa, Nonjaba, and Anishinaabe and Dao. It's an honor to share this virtual circle with so many leading Indigenous experts from around the world and from all 7 directions. And I think it's worthwhile acknowledging where I am, and then where how that relates to, I think, the conversation that Anders just raised. So we're currently located in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. That's currently known as Vancouver, currently north of the Medicine Line, and wanted to focus on, I think, some of the connections that everyone prior to me made between the kind of local to the international. And I think, as Anders said, I think the kind of intersection of the multiple crises that our different nations are facing, creates a system where it can go one or two ways. And I think there's an opportunity to draw, on our collective expertise, on our collective advocacy, and on our collective spirit, noting the leadership of our youth in avoiding what is, I think, something that's commonly happening in multiple different states around the world, not especially in Canada. And want to, I think, kind of use that, I think, framing that was laid out about, as Roberto talked about, connecting those dots, how we're connecting kind of the root cause and problem of what many of these multiple crises stem from, what we consider kind of capitalism, colonization, the overemphasis on carbon, and how that then manifests in our pursuit of intersecting justices, racial justice, Indigenous justice, climate justice, gender justice, disability justice, and noting that there's a panel next week on that specific question, and how they disproportionately impact structurally marginalized people, often which are Indigenous, Black, or other peoples of color. And these are kind of important reflections that I think feed into how we analyze and consider solutions for the climate crisis. So in Canada, since COVID has started, there have been suspensions, delays, cancellations of environmental protections all across the country. One that I wanted to note in particular, and I think it kind of relates to the climate piece, is in Alberta, particularly around the oil sands. And there's been suspensions of monitoring requirements for oil and gas development, monitoring requirements for oil sands development, and then kind of other environmental protections because of the kind of guise of a public safety. Recently, over the last week, Alberta has ended its state of emergency, and so questions are now were those changes in fact responses to the health pandemic, or were they actually in line with the broader kind of extraction agenda that the current Albertan government has? And just wanted to put on people's radar the act that was just passed in Alberta called the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, which actually punishes the act of land defense, and want to, I think, lift up the experience of my brother Robinson about human rights defenders and land protectors, and how important we need to adhere to the protection of those. And I think this is a bill that actively punishes what some of their politicians are calling eco-radical thugs. And I think the experience that our brothers are sharing in Latin America are quite representative of that. At a global scale, I wanted to note a few things. And one of the things that we've seen in media right now is essentially the result of the pandemic on global emissions. And currently it says that there's been a reduction in 2020 emissions anywhere from 4 to 7%. Essentially, in order to meet our goals under the Paris Agreement, we need to maintain that reduction of 7% for the next 10 years, leading to 2030. And so imagine kind of the scale of change and political will required to address the crisis that many of us have just shared. And I think it just speaks to some of the leadership that Frank spoke to about how Indigenous peoples need to step up and show their leadership in regards to what is clearly a absolute failure by states across the globe. Wanted to note, and I might ask Chris to put up the presentation with a few slides, noting that I have to go, that just COP26, the next meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is postponed because of the health pandemic until essentially the same time in November 2021, the 12th or the 2nd to 12th in November. And so, this is the Indigenous Caucus meeting in our daily sessions at COP. You see many of actually the representatives on the call here, noting my relatives, what is now in Chile are there, relatives from Asia, and south of the Medicine Line, Arctic, we have a few of Sami there. And I think just kind of showing that Indigenous participation within the UNFCCC has occurred since the actual convention was created in 1992. And so if I go to the 2 slides from now, we just see that there is a long history of Indigenous participation, Indigenous advocacy within the UNFCCC that has now organized around the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. And so we were formally recognized as a constituency in 2000. We organized into the kind of IIPFCC in 2008. And since then have been, I think, earning an increasingly relevant role in the kind of global climate discussions, noting that there are very real challenges to what is a state-driven process that is predicated on the existence of the nation state, which I think runs contrary to the points that were raised both by Pasang and Anders and in Canada about the role of Indigenous nations in global climate governance, which is, I think, a further conversation. Since it started, there have been around 60 decisions that have been adopted by the COP in relation to Indigenous peoples, their knowledge systems, their role in adaptation and mitigation. The most significant one of which was the recent decision that Pasang and Hindu and Andrea referenced in the creation of the Facilitative Working Group. The Facilitative Working Group being the kind of first example under the UNFCCC where Indigenous peoples and states have kind of equal responsibilities and equal authority in designing what is the potential work plan. I wanted to spend some time on the next slide and noting that I have a couple minutes, just uplifting, and you'll see many of these pictures are actually our Indigenous youth, but the advocacy that they brought towards Article 6. And Article 6 is one of the mechanisms around carbon markets, essentially the creation of an international carbon market. Many problems with that, obviously, one of which is how do we assure that there are appropriate human rights and Indigenous rights safeguards contained within any text or any reference. Noting also that I think there are conceptual problems with essentially relying on a capitalist solution to deal with a capitalist problem. And so, you know, noting that there's that, but then also the protection. And so here we saw many opportunities where our Indigenous relatives stood up and said no. And that essentially caused Article 6 to be punted to COP26. And there are many other decisions that were delayed on that basis. And so I think framing it as a time for inaction is potentially what's most relevant. And then I'll conclude just on the kind of COP26 agenda. And I think given the points that all of our panelists have raised, there is a kind of a very real and kind of very scary consideration about the health pandemic being used to leverage and to minimize action on climate, which I think we've heard in different circumstances is happening right now to our communities on the ground. And so there is an opportunity at COP26 and in each of your nations to essentially guide and advocate for the increased ambition in their nationally determined contributions. 2020 was supposed to be an important year in that regard. 2020 has turned into a little bit of a different year. You know, now's the opportunity with that time span to think about collectively, how do we inform and envision that transformational change required to do the things that, you know, our Indigenous relatives have identified for decades, for centuries, and for thousands of years, noting that our experience is not new, and that we have scholars who talk about, Kyle White being one, about colonial deja vu, how we're essentially revisiting the environmental change that was brought on by colonization. And so, you know, this is an important opportunity to get involved and encourage everyone to reach out to any of us on the call, anyone related to the Indigenous caucus, and we'll look to continue to uplift and amplify the experiences and leadership from Indigenous relatives across the globe. So with that, I'll say Chimigwech. Chimigwech to Roberto, to the panelists. Also want to send you know, my thoughts and prayers to Andrea and Janine and many other of our Indigenous relatives as they deal with the health pandemic and the impact on their communities, and want to uplift the work that everybody is doing. And so thank you, and talk soon.
Thank you so much, Graham. We really appreciate everything that you shared, and it was a really wonderful way to close this week's panel that focused on climate change, COVID-19, and its impacts on Indigenous peoples. We don't, unfortunately, we do not have time for questions, but we think that probably there needs to be a part 2 of this subject area, because there was so much to share, and it would really be important to enter into some of that dialogue. I did present in the chat an update that we will have a seminar next week, same time, focusing on Indigenous peoples with disabilities and the effects of COVID-19 on this specific sector of our communities, and also that the information, the contact information for each one of the esteemed panelists that we had with us today is available at the IITC website. I added that web address here. If you would like to follow up with one of these presenters directly, please go to the site. You can get their email and contact them from there and enter into the dialogue that you need to enter into. With that, I just want to say again, thank you so much to each one of these presenters. They really shared so much excellent information. We had no doubt from the beginning when the panel got together that this would be, unfortunately, it was so much information, we didn't get to do any interactive dialogue. But we hope to have this presentation shared through the IITC IITC networks, get it up on the internet so that more people can appreciate what was shared today. And again, before I close out, I want to thank our translators, Rebecca and Jimmy, who really do an excellent job in making sure that we reached the most people possible. So thank you once again to Frank, to Hindu, Pasang, Robinson, Anders, and Graham for the excellent presentations. And again, we send out, as people have mentioned, send out our thoughts and prayers for Andrea and her family and her husband Angel, and for what they're going through now. And we will continue to update folks on our next activities. But thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Chris, we will be able to end the webinar now. Thank you to all.
Thank you.